Paris, the heart of Europe, and home to one of the most majestic of medieval palaces. It stands between the banks of the Seine on an island that's barely 20 hectares, the Île de la Cité. Built in the early Middle Ages, two vestiges of this grandiose palace remain. The Sainte-Chapelle, the largest and most ambitious palatial chapel of the time, and the Conciergerie, a room of staggering proportions. These unique places demanded ingenious new construction techniques.
The Sainte-Chapelle is special because it embodied heaven for the people of the 13th century.
When you see these glass walls, the place they take, you don't see any of the stone in the upper chapel. It's truly a highlight of the rayonnant Gothic architecture.
We make things the highest, the biggest, and the most beautiful, simply to affirm that we are superior. That's why they made it the largest room in the medieval West at the time.
To erect such structures, the builders faced one daunting challenge after another.
It had to support a very tall building. They used a metallic kind of belting that corsets the construction to prevent the walls from moving apart.
The architect was obliged to use very thick buttresses.
Because of the room's massive weight, it obviously had to be supported by the entire structure.
And they had to do it on wet, unstable soil. But how?
It was incredibly humid. The pillars collapsed. The vaults had to be redone. So there were real problems with the stability of the northern section of the building.
Rib vaults, an iron frame, and massive load-bearing pillars enabled these two buildings to stand the test of time. Marie-Antoinette was imprisoned in the Conciergerie in the 18th century, and the buildings stand strong today. By studying the almost imperceptible details, archaeologists, architects, and historians reveal the construction techniques that made the Sainte-Chapelle and the Conciergerie the most illustrious buildings of the Middle Ages. Île de la Cité, in the heart of Paris, in the middle of the Seine. It was here in the 6th century, the start of the Middle Ages, that the kings chose to build their palace. The city was in full development, protected by the river and strategically placed at the crossroads of two major traffic axes. In the 11th century, the Notre Dame Cathedral was being built on the island at one of the era's biggest construction sites, and the Palais de la Cité needed to compete.
On the eastern side of the island was the cathedral, which represented the episcopal power. So it was in the king's interest to manifest his power on the opposite side of the Île de la Cité, facing the religious power.
It was under the reign of Louis IX that the palace asserted its strength against the religious powers, thanks to an extraordinary event.
Between 1226 and 1270, St. Louis IV, the great king of France, had a truly extraordinary idea. He acquired the relics of Christ's Passion.
He made a political and religious move. In fact, by acquiring the richest, most precious, most extraordinary relics of Christendom.
The most precious relic was the crown of thorns of Jesus.
The acquisition of the crown of thorns had an eminently political function, since it was meant to make Paris a new Jerusalem.
He decided to place these relics in the enclosure of his palace, within a sanctuary that was built explicitly to house them.
For the crown of thorns, Louis IX wanted to build a chapel that was unique for the era. He wanted it to be the highest, the brightest, and the most spacious. And above all, he wanted it to have a special shape. He wanted it to look like a box that contains precious relics. A reliquary,
Louis IX wanted to really monumentalize the reliquary and place it just outside the city as a stone reliquary. Saint Louis had an architect who built the Sainte-Chapelle invent an entirely new form of architecture.
We need to understand that, back then they didn't have the kind of media bombardment that we have today, and so all forms had meanings, and meanings that people understood and could be interpreted.
The Sainte-Chapelle would become a stone reliquary. Its construction began around 1242. The chapel had to be as high as the towers of Notre Dame, which tower some 40 meters above the ground. But how to construct such a building in such a small space on the island's wet and unstable soil? At the time, the Île de la Cité was divided into two hills. Between the two, there were marshes, and a thick layer of silt had been deposited over the centuries.
In this type of alluvial environment, where the rock isn't flush at ground level, you're forced to dig down several meters so that you can establish solid foundations for the masonry that will eventually rise up above the ground.
The water had to be evacuated. That's the first thing. Drainage systems had to be built. They had to build something to prevent the Seine's waters from coming in. But they had already had foundations, since the Romans had already built something significant there.
Underneath the lower chapel, they would have dug deep foundations. There was another chapel even in its place before the Sainte-Chapelle was there. But we don't know anything about that since it hasn't been excavated.
Although the foundations were based on older constructions, it wasn't enough to support such a structure. The builders had to imagine a system that would allow them to construct it more than 40 meters high. But they took advantage of a constraint imposed by the king. Louis IX wanted a two-story chapel.
The two levels were an earthly level and a celestial level, so you had the architectural principles being commanded by the theological vision of the times.
It isn't a chapel, it's two chapels, one on top of another, and they each have quite different functions.
Remember that the Sainte-Chapelle and the entire Palais de la Cité had two levels. A higher level that was reserved for the king and his distinguished guests, and a lower level that was for the commoners, in other words, the staff of the palace, the servants, etc.
The two levels were well separated. A level at the bottom for public mass, and an upper level for the king and his family. The builders took the two-level constraint and used it to their advantage.
In fact, the builders designed the Sainte-Chapelle as a nested structure, where the lower chapel served as a base for the upper chapel.
But how did the builders achieve the duality of making the lower chapel a large and spacious reception area that was also a foundation for the upper chapel? The builders used a technique well mastered at the time: rib vaults. Each pillar is the base of the stone ribs that make up the vault. It was then sealed by a central stone called the keystone. This stone stabilizes the structure that rests only on the pillars using no load-bearing walls.
Rib vaults are one of the means used to better distribute the forces on the pillars.
It's really a key structural element that's fundamental to Gothic architecture. It's a guarantee of stability that allows for the construction of larger spaces that are freer, very open, and have very large dimensions.
The builders had to deal with another constraint: aligning the top of the lower chapel's vaults with the entryway to the king's quarters. But they also had to make sure the ceilings in the lower chapel were as high as possible. To do so, they built vaults that were almost flat.
The lower chapel was a true architectural achievement because it has a vault that's wide but extremely flat, and as a result, the forces are very horizontal. This meant they needed complementary reinforcement systems that could support these columns in order to withstand the weight of the vaults.
By building flat vaults, the forces are mostly distributed horizontally instead of vertically, which could lead to the pillars separating beneath their weight. To counter this horizontal force, the builders had an idea.
It was already a challenge for them to ensure that the weight of these vaults and the weight of the upper chapel wouldn't cause the walls to separate. This is the reason why, when you go to the lower chapel, you see that there's an aisle with two side aisles, where the vaults rest on pillars, which then press against the walls.
That is really an architectural tour de force, because it's one of the earliest times, if not the earliest time, where you have this lower chapel that's been pushed outwards by using columns to support the vault. So it almost looks like a three-part church. So the architect was really daring in that lower chapel.
To prevent the forces from being too horizontal, the builders directed them onto intermediate pillars, which makes it possible to push back the walls. The chapel is therefore composed of a main aisle and two side aisles. But that wasn't enough to ensure the stability of the lower chapel and elevate the upper chapel. So the builders used a well-known process, but also innovated once again.
The designers came up with a pretty awesome idea. Between the pillars and the outer walls, they added small flying buttresses, which are themselves accompanied by two tie beams above and below, which obviously adds very high stability to the building, but at the same time keeps this idea of lightness. And the interior flying buttresses were pierced, simply to show that even though they were there to ensure stability, it was possible to do that. Here's the purpose of the small flying buttresses that are inside the building and not on the outside. They're actually placed in the side aisles and serve to connect the different parts of the building to prevent the walls from spreading under the weight of the upper level.
By placing flying buttresses inside the building between each pillar of the side aisles and adding iron tie beams, the builders managed to stabilize the lower chapel to prepare the elevation of the building upwards.
It's really like a tiered cake, in that they made the first level so strong that it could make every part of the structure seem as lightweight as it could possibly be.
The builders then focused on the second chapel, that of the king, the one that would receive the holy relic, the crown of thorns. It had to meet the requirements of Louis IX, who wanted a luminosity that had never yet been achieved.
It was necessary to give a majestic scale to this royal chapel, and the primordial visual effect was this sort of transparency. Even though the building was still 42 meters high, it was really very exceptional.
But how to build such a high vault with a level of luminosity unprecedented in medieval history? The builders had to do the opposite of what was commonly done in Gothic art.
Normally in this period of Gothic architecture, with the building that's 29.5 meters tall, you would expect it to have some kind of flying buttress.
In the Gothic period, cathedral walls were supported by flying buttresses on the exterior to prevent them from spreading apart. But the king wanted a reliquary shape featuring a single aisle, so there couldn't be flying buttresses outside to hold the walls together.
You can't have flying buttresses on either side of a single nave building.
They had to find a way to strengthen this single aisle that towered dozens of meters above ground. Therefore, the architect had to implement the use of very thick buttresses.
Very large buttresses that overcompensate even for the size of the chapel and the height of the chapel. They're the same size as those, or very close to those at Notre Dame.
To build this unique structure, the builders placed 8 buttresses on either side of the Sainte-Chapelle, measuring almost 30 meters high. 6 other strong, extremely thick buttresses were placed in the chancel and were part of the walls of the Sainte-Chapelle.
The buttresses are very strong. They're very high, and they're essential to the structure of the building. They aren't visible in the upper chapel because they're cleverly concealed by a network of fine columns.
These little colonnettes and shafts hide the thickness and the architectonic quality of the buttress and make it very decorative instead. So one doesn't get a sense of the structure of the building from the inside.
It's a truly technical feat that uses elements of known architecture, but in a brand new way. And that is what allowed the majestic elevations we can see in the Sainte-Chapelle to exist.
This architectural feat made it possible to hollow out the walls and add the glass windows that illuminated the Sainte-Chapelle like no other building at the time.
The upper chapel rises to the sky and opens up to the sky, like a chamber of heaven.
To accentuate this impression of grandeur and height, the builders placed the buttresses judiciously. They actually get closer and closer to one another as one gets closer to the chancel in the center. The creation of such a high vanishing point increases perspective and gives the visitor the impression of being pulled towards the sky by the light. But the buttresses alone were not enough to support the building. The pillars could still separate. They had to find a way to hold them all together. How did the builders go about stabilizing the Sainte-Chapelle, allowing it to last for centuries? Maxime Leretier and his team found the answer in the attic of the chapel.
There, at the level of the third foundation of the side wall, you can see the remains of a tie beam that was laid in medieval times. This tie beam most likely passed through the entire aisle above the vaults. It probably connected the north wall to the south wall to consolidate the masonry back before it was covered by the frame and the upper parts of the building.
These large iron beams traversed the building from one side to the other and prevented the walls from spreading during construction. While doing further research, Maxime Leretier found another clue about the use of iron to maintain the building. It's this piece of iron dating from medieval times and which seems to have been forgotten on a low wall. What was it used for? Researchers eventually understood. It's an iron staple that fit with other staples to form a linked chain that enclosed the building. It's like a Meccano set, which formed a powerful belt around the whole chapel.
The upper Sainte-Chapelle, just like the lower Sainte-Chapelle, is a kind of extraordinary iron cage. A very high building has to be supported. So, from top to bottom, there were these metal belts that corseted the construction to prevent the walls from moving apart.
The Sainte-Chapelle was literally surrounded at the top and bottom by ironclad stones. But the builders still had doubts.
I do think that they were concerned with having structural issues to hold that glass in.
It had to stand up to the winds and maintain these huge stained glass windows that could not have resisted the pressure.
By observing the stained glass windows, researchers distinguished cleverly concealed iron bars that seemed to participate in the building's structure.
The stained glass windows made it possible to integrate, in an elegant and refined way, metal elements that contribute to the corseting of the construction.
The stained glass windows are gridded by iron bars placed horizontally and vertically. In total, 2 metal chains and a complete grid within the stained glass windows enclose the building and affix the 14-strong buttresses.
It's actually a very bold structure in that it features iron that's been added to the glass and to the stone to strengthen the entire structure of the building.
This is a very comprehensive kind of cage that reinforces the stone vaulting that we see in the Sainte-Chapelle. And that iron grid is one of the most prolific early uses of iron to support a building like that we know of.
The windows contain 1,113 pieces of glass. Each design was carefully chosen to enforce the power of the king, because the Sainte-Chapelle was, above all, a building that echoed his authority.
It's like a comic strip that includes the story of Louis IX. You see the transfer of the crown of thorns. I think that's the end of the stained glass windows of the Sainte-Chapelle.
He put himself in the scene as a successor of Christ and the kings of the Old Testament. He knew exactly what he was doing. It's a political story told through the Sainte-Chapelle windows.
All the architecture of the Sainte-Chapelle was designed to impose the power of Louis IX. It was an unescapable building in the Parisian landscape of the Middle Ages. But there was still something missing to ensure it dominated all other buildings, especially the nearby Notre Dame Cathedral, which was under construction. Louis IX wanted a spire.
Remember that the Bishop of Paris was very powerful, and he also owned a large part of the city's land. So the king had every interest in manifesting his power on the opposite side of the Ile de la Cité and the religious power. So when the spire of the Sainte-Chapelle was built, it had to be taller than, or at least as high as, Notre Dame's towers.
It was a time of rivalry, so it made sense for the king to mark his territory when facing off with the bishop on the other side.
But building a spire would prove to be a great architectural challenge.
The first spire was built in the 13th century. The one we have today is actually the 5th one they built, so they made several attempts.
It was like a sign of the chaos to come. Of course, spires are more prone to risks and accidents like lightning in particular, or fires, than other parts of the building, but it's still a bad sign.
It's technically very complicated because you get a lot of strong winds when you go high up, so the winds are an issue. It needs to be weighted down. It needs to be strongly connected to those buttresses. It needs to not interfere with the vaults.
In total, over 6 centuries, there were 5 spires. Fires, lightning, strong winds, and stability problems struck, leaving just this final one still standing, which dates from the 19th century and is similar to the one Louis IX wanted. Before construction ended, another building would be added to the Sainte-Chapelle, an element that contributes to its fame.
The Trésor des Chartes was a kind of mini Sainte-Chapelle. It was attached to the Sainte-Chapelle and can be seen in many depictions and engravings until the fire of 1770.
Destroyed in the 18th century, It was accessible from the lower chapel. There is still the door that allowed access to it. The barely visible moldings end on a walled entrance, behind which was the Trésor des Chartes. But why build this miniature chapel? What was its function?
We believe it was built at the same time as the Sainte-Chapelle, but when in the process was it decided? Because it's in a very strange place, the Trésor des Chartes. When you came into the Palais de la Cité, it's the first thing you would have seen, not the Sainte-Chapelle first, because it was covering. So I think there is some, unplanned things from the beginning, while the main chapel itself they were focusing on.
Decided on at the last minute, this miniature Sainte-Chapelle had real importance for the king.
The building contained jewels and relics in abundance from dozens of saints, including the nursing Madonna, the Holy Sepulchre, almost the whole panoply of saints. But above all, there was another treasure, the Trésor des Chartes, the archives of the Capetian family. Wills, marriage contracts, title deeds to fiefs, and also everything related to secret procedures and treaties with foreign kings. It was a place where titles of ownership and the most important documents were carefully stored.
In less than 7 years, record time, the Sainte-Chapelle sprung out of the ground. It shone throughout Europe. People hurried to see and admire it. It contained what was most precious to the king.
People who went to these places in the Middle Ages did so as if they were visiting the end of the ages. They didn't see what we see. We can't fully understand. They believed in the end of time and were told that it represented paradise.
We know that the English king was a bit jealous of it when he saw it. And there were songs that were written about how the English king coveted the Sainte-Chapelle and wanted to take it home with him. So that's kind of fun. So that shows that it was sort of a special building at the time.
It was unique architecture that was also a landmark, because the Sainte-Chapelle served as a model that was reproduced in other buildings, such as the Sainte-Chapelle de Saint-Germain-de-Fly and the Sainte-Chapelle of the Château de Vincennes.
The Sainte-Chapelle of Vincennes was built a century later.
The royal family built several in France. This model was also replicated throughout Europe in areas that were impacted by France.
The Palais de la Cité radiated throughout Europe. The king settled permanently in the enclosure. France prospered and grew. It was thus necessary to build new spaces that were ever larger and ever more majestic. And Philip the Fair, the grandson of Louis IX, took on the task.
Philip the Fair's idea was very simple: to compete with all the monarchs of his time, which included the emperor, the King of England, obviously, but also spiritual monarchs like the Pope.
Philip the Fair clearly brought the palace to its peak. It was under Philip the Fair that the palace expanded considerably. Its surface actually tripled in size. To do so, they had to rationalize the spaces that were sometimes quite old, and most of all, build a palace that equaled the influence of the monarchy of the time.
Philip the Fair imagined a new way of governing. He wanted a palace that resembled his new politics.
Philip the Fair modernized the entire palace to bring it into line with the management of the kingdom. Administrative management, legal management, economic management, and currency management. It was really a place that centralized all the current ministries in the management of France.
He expands the palace so that he makes it a much more showcase kind of place than it had ever been. As Louis adds the chapel, but then his grandson comes and finishes the other side of the project.
The whole palace was constructed around these great institutions, creating a palace that was no longer really for the king, but above all, for the state.
He designed a huge palace. Today, only the Conciergerie remains, which is composed of several rooms that include kitchens, the guards' room, and finally the Hall of the Soldiers. It's the largest of medieval times, larger than Notre Dame. Measuring 68 meters long and 27 meters wide, no room had ever been so vast.
These are, in fact, the remains of an extremely prestigious palace that dates from the Middle Ages. When you see these dimensions for the first time and remember the fact that this room has remained the largest room of civil architecture in Europe, it's still really very, very impressive.
But its construction was complex and fraught with pitfalls. Architect Enguerrand de Marigny worked on this new palace to triple its surface. But very quickly he was confronted with a major problem: the banks of the Seine. To enlarge the palace for the Conciergerie, the builders had no choice but to approach the river.
There were moisture problems due to the Seine being to the north. They were really at the maximum of how close they could get to the north shore of the island.
They were much closer to the Seine, so the land was much marshier. It must have been even more marshy than today, since the riverbanks were different. They were gently sloped.
These are wetlands, alluvial environments. That meant that the buildings couldn't rest directly on the rocks. So the builders had to pay particular attention to the stability of the buildings that they were planning to build on that location.
Solid and effective foundations had to be designed. One of the hypotheses is that the builders used a technique used in Roman times.
The solution for many buildings being built in this kind of environment was to lay the foundations on wooden piles made from tree trunks. They are typically hammered into the ground as deep as possible, and then they're leveled to a uniform height. The building's foundations are then laid on these pilings.
A huge stone, raised with a pulley system, was used to drive the wooden piles in one by one. It was hard work that left no room for error.
It required very precise implementation. Each time there was a group of stakes, and they had to drive a group of 4 to 6 stakes into the ground per column.
The foundations of the Conciergerie also relied on the island's older buildings. The Ile de la Cité was always occupied. In Neolithic times, the Roman era, and eventually in the Middle Ages. Over thousands of years, man built ever larger buildings here.
Perhaps this history of recuperating previously built elements played a role in the foundations. There was already a stone in place, so that was done, and it helped solidify the building's walls.
In addition to the wooden piles to lay the foundations on, the builders followed part of the existing walls, encompassing old ramparts and buildings to ensure the stability of the structure. But another challenge faced the construction of the Conciergerie: the risk of flooding.
We know the Ile de la Cité flooded dozens of times and during every ancient regime. We have dates, and the dates of catastrophic floods are well known. This island has obviously been inundated with water quite often because the flow of the Seine, like all rivers, varies.
There were 2 or 3 great floods per century that caused absolutely monstrous devastation, sweeping away bridges, submerging houses. The palace was submerged a few times in its history.
So the idea of a 2-story palace was necessary to protect oneself and the upper level from the water.
It was a way to guard against possible flooding and avoid certain damages, especially to the more noble upper parts of the building.
In addition to protecting from floods, a 2-story palace corresponds to the era's architectural ideas and the design of the Sainte-Chapelle.
This system of lower rooms and upper rooms reflects a very simple and very functional idea. It's to give a hierarchy to the spaces. The location in which we are today, as majestic as it seems, is a service area for people like you and me, and not the elites who dominated above, whether it was the king, the lords he received, or eventually the parliament, which took over these spaces.
Here again, the architect used the lower rooms as foundations to support the staterooms.
It's like the Sainte-Chapelle. The lower part supported the very large upper room. It was extremely reinforced, not very high, and very strong. The salle des gendarmes had to be designed to support the large room above it. And it was functional too, since that's where they came to get daily supplies. There were nearly 2,000 servants and armed men, or gendarmes, hence the name. So it had an important structural function, but at the same time it also served a functional purpose.
To combine vast space and structural power, the architect used a technique already implemented in the Sainte-Chapelle: rib vaults. But this time, he used it on a scale that had never been seen before. The rib vaults were added to one another as independent modules. For each new module, the builders added a flange between the pillars and a flange for the rib vault. The room was built this way from east to west, with the modules added to one another over 67 meters. In all, 36 pillars were laid.
Thanks to these rib vaults applied in the form of small construction modules, we achieve a dual function. It creates a vast space, and it absorbs the force and weight of the upper structure. That offers significant stability for the foundations, especially when built on wetlands, like the Île de la Cité.
These rib vaults act like chains that retain the many different load-bearing elements of the structure. They also create a frame, a horizontal frame, upon which the builders could build more.
The builders thus covered an area of 1,900 square meters, more than 3 times the surface of Notre Dame.
You have to imagine that at the time, this place was extremely bright and open on the ground floor, and at the same time very lively, since it was constantly swarming with all the servants who came to eat daily and the 4 fireplaces that were there to warm the area.
It wasn't a quiet place. It was incredibly noisy.
Remember that the palace was always open to the public, the inhabitants, the citizens. Hundreds of people went in and out every day. It's a palace in the middle of the city, and it has always been.
Everything was planned to welcome the citizens. More than 2,000 people had lunch at the palace: janitors, policemen, stewards. The kitchens designed by the builders were huge, and one on the palace's lower level is still in existence today.
The kitchens, as we can see them today, are rooms that are 4-sided spaces, which feature huge fireplaces in the corners, which is really quite original. We believe that there must have also been kitchens in the upper part of the palace as well.
The kitchen is one of the largest ever made. To stabilize it, Flying buttresses were placed in the room's four corners and iron tie beams inserted in the stone. Today, the entire first level of the palace is preserved in testament to its grandeur.
What marks us is the size. It has really impressive dimensions, it's enormous, and it features this very regular and systematic effect of the rib vaults, which are indicative of a solid architecture.
But looking at the details, we realize that not everything is symmetric and perfect. This detail is found at the top of the pillars.
There are differences in the shape of the supports, in the degree of refinement of the finish of the capitals.
Initially, in the space we're in, for example, you can see the capitals are beautifully carved with plant motifs, of course. But at the end of the room, towards the east, you can see smooth capitals, which seems due not to restoration as you could imagine, but simply wanting to move faster and save time in that section.
For the builders were pressed for time. They had to tackle the upper room because that is what would impose the power of the king. It was to be called the Grande Salle and would radiate throughout Europe.
The Grande Salle was very widely well known as this amazing, huge building, so large, with a series of columns going down the middle, those columns embellished by full-size sculptures of the French kings, declaring dynastic continuity. And we have to think of this room being used for banqueting, feasting.
It must be 68 meters long. It's huge, even bigger than the Palace of Westminster at the time. And so clearly with this room, the king marked his preeminence. It's a real stateroom.
And indeed, without a doubt, it was one of the largest ceremonial and palatial halls in Europe in the 14th century.
The room was necessarily sumptuous since it represented the kingdom.
Composed of a double nave, the frame was made of wood to lighten the structure. Only one row of central pillars supports the building. Huge transverse beams hold the vaults to prevent them from spreading. But how did the builders ensure the stability of the room? By what means did they support the weight of the King's Hall? Just below, in the Salle des Gendarmes, the pillars don't all have the same sections. The central pillars are thicker than those of the side aisles.
So the Salle des Gendarmes, it has these amazing piers in the middle of it, which are really the main supports for the piers above that were holding those, the central row of columns in the Grande Salle. So that can explain those very heavily reinforced piers in the middle of that lower Salle des Gendarmes.
They're reinforced because they supported the column line of the upper room. So it's a question of vertical supports. They bear all the weight of the upper columns, along with the weight of the entire frame as well.
The upper room perfectly aligns with the pillars of the lower room, essentially making the Salle des Gendarmes a base with rows of regularly spaced columns to support the king's room. But despite massive pillars and powerful rib vaults, the structure of the building was not as stable as the builders hoped. And over the centuries, there were several problems that weakened the structure.
There was a collapse in that area.
The vaults collapsed, so presumably there were stability issues.
The humidity and the unstable ground weakened the building. And very quickly, a solution had to be found to prevent the whole room from collapsing.
We know that there were stability problems from the middle of the 15th century because the entire architectural structure was doubled at that time. The ribs, the so-called rib vaults, were doubled to support the upper room. So we believe there must have been a stability problem apparent at the time.
In the Salle des Gendarmes, each rib of the rib vault is doubled by an additional rib, which is much thicker. The diameter of the pillars was therefore increased to place these new reinforcements. In the adjacent room, the guards' room is the same. All the ribs were doubled. The builders may have overestimated the strength of the vaults they had placed, which over the centuries had to be strengthened. Despite all these precautions, disaster struck the Conciergerie. A powerful and uncontrollable fire broke out in 1618. The King's Hall was totally destroyed. The builders decided to reconstruct it a few years later, but the architect made a mistake.
He didn't place the pillars at the exact height of those in the lower room, so it caused a partial collapse of the vaults. And so in the 19th century, he tried to correct it by reinforcing the pillars of the central spans to strengthen the structure.
The entire stone structure was reinforced to ensure the stability of the building. But the great ceremonial hall was destroyed again under the Paris Commune in 1871. Today, the public area of the Palais de Justice is located above the Salle des Gendarmes. It retains the idea of the double nave with central pillars. But during its reconstruction, the architects added a staircase, making it necessary to reinforce the Salle des Gendarmes to support its weight.
When the courthouse built a large staircase upstairs, it was also necessary to support the vaults of the Conciergerie. So we have a series of pillars that are not at all like the others and that were clearly added much later.
4 large pillars in the middle of the rib vaults betray this problem of stability. Over the centuries, Philip the Fair's Conciergerie underwent several transformations. One part served as a prison cell for the legendary Marie-Antoinette. Then it was forgotten and served as a storage room. The docks were also raised to channel the river and protect the island from flooding.
Look at the ground level of the room. It's more or less at the medieval circulation level here. But then you have to go up 2 to 3 meters to reach the circulation level of the Boulevard du Palais.
In all, the medieval-era circulation level of the Ile de la Cité was raised more than 4 meters. Despite all of these modifications, the Salle des Gendarmes remains a precious testimony of the glorious era of the Capetian kings and the mid-medieval period.
We must still realize that we're talking about buildings that have exceptional longevity anyway, because these are structures that were built at the very beginning of the 14th century. Imagine, it's the 21st century and they're still here. But in addition, there are all the constructions above that were built to meet the changing needs of the courthouse, and there were fires and floods that have taken place.
What's fascinating when I take students today is I say, actually, the structure is still there. It's a kind of, we say, palimpsest of what always used to be there. You still have the Conciergerie, which was the support for the Grand Salle. That's really amazing. And then the Sainte-Chapelle, fortunately, is still there.
Along with the Sainte-Chapelle, these 2 buildings remain the last vestiges of the Palais de la Cité and testify to the know-how of the builders of the time. They convey the emotions the builders wanted to arouse in visitors, both in the past and in the present.
The effect that this type of monument still has on visitors, even today, should make us reflect on the potential emotional and cultural shock that the Sainte-Chapelle could have evoked in people who visited this monument back in the 13th century.
More than 9 centuries later, the Palais de la Cité continues to shine over the Ile de la Cité, and the Sainte-Chapelle still stands in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Thanks to 2 kings, Philip the Fair and Louis IX, who by their ambition marked the history of France, these 2 buildings of exceptional grandeur have stood the test of time to testify to the magnificence of the Palais de la Cité.